I was 24 years old and working as a software developer in Portland. My best friend Jake had just moved to this incredibly remote house about an hour and a half outside the city. He had inherited it from his grandfather and decided to fix it up as a weekend retreat. The place was literally in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but farmland and forest for miles in every direction. There wasn't even cell phone service for the last 20 minutes of the drive. It was a Friday night in late October, and I'd driven out to help Jake install some new flooring. We'd been working all day, drinking a few beers, and just catching up like old times. By the time we finished, it was already past midnight. I was exhausted. My back was killing me from all the manual labor, and honestly, I just wanted to crash on his couch and drive home in the morning. But I had an important client meeting at 9 a.m. on Saturday that I absolutely couldn't miss. This was a potential contract worth 6 figures for my freelance business, and I'd been working toward this opportunity for months. Jake tried to convince me to stay. "Dude, just call him and reschedule. It's not safe driving this tired, especially on these back roads." He was right about the roads. The route to his place was mostly 2-lane highways that wound through vast stretches of farmland. During the day, you might see a car every few minutes, but at night, especially this late, the roads were completely deserted. No streetlights, no houses, no gas stations for miles at a time. Just endless darkness on both sides of the road. But I was stubborn and convinced myself I'd be fine. I'd made this drive dozens of times before. I loaded up on coffee, rolled down the windows to keep the cold air hitting my face, and cranked up some loud music. Jake walked me to my car, still trying to talk me out of it. "At least text me when you get home," he said, "and if you start feeling too tired, just pull over somewhere safe and take a nap." I promised him I would and started the long drive home. For the first 20 minutes, everything was normal. The coffee was working, the music was keeping me alert, and I was making good time. The road was completely empty, which actually made it easier to drive. No need to worry about other drivers or passing anyone. Just me, my headlights cutting through the darkness, and the familiar rhythm of the road. Then I saw something that made me slam on my brakes harder than I needed to. Right in the middle of my lane, perfectly upright and positioned like someone had carefully placed it there, was a large suitcase. Not just any suitcase, but one of those expensive-looking hard-shell cases, the kind you'd take on an international business trip. It was standing completely vertical, as if someone had just set it down and walked away. The thing that struck me immediately was how perfectly positioned it was. It wasn't lying on its side like it had fallen out of a truck. It wasn't damaged or beat up like it had been in an accident. It was just standing there, right in the center of the lane, like a roadblock. I sat there for probably a full minute, just staring at it. My tired brain was trying to process what I was seeing. How does a suitcase end up standing upright in the middle of a deserted road at 1 a.m.? The logical explanation was that it had fallen from someone's vehicle and somehow landed that way. But the more I looked at it, the less likely that seemed. The positioning was too perfect, too deliberate. I considered getting out to move it, but something about the whole situation felt off. Maybe it was just because I was tired and on edge, but I had this nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Instead, I decided to just go around it. The road was empty, so I carefully moved into the oncoming lane, gave the suitcase a wide berth, and continued on my way. As I passed it, I got a better look. It was definitely expensive, probably leather, and it looked brand new. No scratches, no dirt, nothing to suggest it had been sitting there for any length of time. I checked my rearview mirror as I drove away, and I could see it in my taillights, still standing there perfectly upright in the middle of the road. I tried to put it out of my mind and focus on getting home, but I couldn't shake the image. Who travels with a suitcase like that on these back roads, and how does it end up positioned so perfectly in the middle of the lane? The more I thought about it, the more questions I had, and the fewer answers made sense. About 5 minutes later, I was starting to relax again when my headlights illuminated something else that made my blood run cold. There was a pickup truck parked directly in the middle of the road, completely blocking my lane. It was an older model, maybe from the 80s or 90s, dark-colored and sitting at a slight angle like it had been hastily abandoned. No lights were on, no hazard blinkers, no indication that anyone was trying to signal for help or warn other drivers. If I hadn't had my high beams on, I might not have seen it until it was too late. I stopped about 50 feet behind it and waited, expecting to see some sign of life. Maybe the driver was having mechanical problems or had run out of gas, but nothing happened. No one got out, no interior lights came on, no movement at all. I honked my horn a few times, thinking maybe the driver had fallen asleep or was having some kind of medical emergency. Still nothing. After waiting for about 30 seconds, I slowly pulled into the oncoming lane to go around it. As I did, I got a closer look at the truck, and what I saw made me even more uneasy. The vehicle was covered in dents and scrapes, but they didn't look like normal wear and tear. They looked fresh, like the truck had recently been in some kind of accident or altercation. The passenger side was particularly damaged, with what looked like impact marks and scratched paint. More disturbing was the fact that I couldn't see anyone inside. The windows weren't tinted, and with my headlights shining directly into the cab, I should have been able to see the outline of a driver or passenger. But the truck appeared to be completely empty. No one in the front seat, no one in the back of the extended cab. Just an abandoned vehicle sitting in the middle of a deserted road. I pulled ahead of the truck and got back into my lane, but I couldn't resist slowing down to look around. We were in the middle of absolutely nowhere. Farmland stretched out in every direction with no houses, no driveways, no side roads visible. Why would someone abandon their vehicle here? And where had they gone? You'd have to walk for miles in any direction to reach civilization. The whole situation was giving me serious creeps, and I decided I didn't want to stick around to figure it out. I pressed the gas and continued down the road, but now I was wide awake and my mind was racing. Two strange objects in the road within 5 minutes of each other. That couldn't be a coincidence, could it? I was starting to think the suitcase and the truck were somehow connected when I was forced to stop for a third time. There was a man standing in the middle of the road directly in my lane, waving his arms to get my attention. He appeared to be in his early 40s, average height and build, but he looked like he'd been through hell. His clothes were dirty and torn, his hair was disheveled, and even from a distance I could see cuts and scrapes on his hands and arms. He looked like someone who'd been in a fight or an accident. When I stopped, he immediately smiled and walked toward my driver's side window. Despite his rough appearance, his demeanor seemed friendly, almost relieved to see me. I rolled the window down just a crack, keeping my doors locked. "Hey there," he said, slightly out of breath. "Thank God someone finally came along. Did you happen to see a truck back that way?" He gestured in the direction I'd come from. "Yeah, I did," I replied cautiously. "Is that yours?" "Yeah, ran out of gas about a mile back. Think you could give me a lift back there? I've got a gas can in the bed. Just need someone to drive me back so I can fill her up." His story sounded reasonable enough, but something about it didn't add up. If he'd run out of gas, why would he need a ride back to the truck? Wouldn't he want me to drive him to a gas station to fill up the can? And if the truck was only a mile back, why did he look so beat up? It shouldn't take more than 20 minutes to walk that distance. "Why don't I just drive you to a gas station instead?" I suggested. "There's one about 15 miles up the road." The man's expression flickered for just a moment, like I'd caught him off guard. "Well, the thing is, I already walked all the way out here, and I'm pretty tired. It would be a lot easier if you could just run me back to the truck real quick." As he was talking, my eyes wandered past him to the side of the road, and I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. Partially hidden in the tall crops about 30 feet off the road was the rear end of a small car. It was pushed deep into the field, and I could only see one of the taillights reflecting the light from my headlights. The car was definitely not supposed to be there. I looked back at the man who was still talking and seemed oblivious to what I'd spotted, but now his friendly demeanor seemed forced, almost theatrical. The cuts on his hands and arms took on a more sinister meaning, and his story about running out of gas made even less sense. "You know what?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm actually running really late. I'm sorry, but I can't help you out." I started to roll up my window, but the man's entire demeanor changed instantly. The friendly smile vanished, replaced by a cold, angry expression. His eyes widened, and he lunged toward my car, grabbing the window before I could get it all the way up. "Hey, where are you going?" he shouted, his voice completely different now, aggressive and threatening. "I just need a ride back to my truck." He started pounding on my window with his fist, and I could see the cuts on his knuckles more clearly now. They looked fresh, like he'd been in a recent fight. I threw the car into drive and hit the gas, pulling away as fast as I could. In my rearview mirror, I could see him standing in the road, watching me drive away. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my cell phone. Thankfully, I was just far enough from Jake's place that I had a weak signal. I called 911 and tried to explain what I'd seen as clearly as possible. The dispatcher kept me on the line while I drove, asking for detailed descriptions and exact locations. When the police arrived at the scene about an hour later, the truck was gone. There was no sign of the man I'd encountered, but the car I'd spotted in the field was still there, and according to the officer I spoke with later, the scene was far worse than I could have imagined. The car belonged to a 28-year-old woman named Sarah Chen, who had been reported missing 3 days earlier. She'd been driving home from her job at a hospital in the next county when she disappeared. The police found her body in the trunk of her own car. She hadn't died in an accident. She'd been murdered. The investigation revealed that Sarah had likely been flagged down by someone pretending to need help, just like the man had tried to do with me. The theory was that the suitcase and the abandoned truck were both part of an elaborate setup designed to get drivers to stop. The suitcase would make people curious or concerned about road debris. If they didn't stop for that, the abandoned truck would force them to slow down and potentially offer assistance. And if those didn't work, there was always a person in distress standing in the road. The man I encountered was never identified or caught. The truck he'd claimed was his was never found either, which meant it was probably stolen and abandoned somewhere else after I escaped. The police believed he was responsible for Sarah's death and possibly other disappearances in the area that had gone unsolved. What haunts me the most is how close I came to becoming another victim. If I hadn't spotted that car in the field, if I'd been a little more trusting or a little more tired, I might have agreed to give him a ride. And then I would have been trapped in a vehicle with a killer, probably driving towards some remote location where no one would ever find me. The whole thing was so carefully planned and executed. The suitcase positioned to create curiosity, the truck placed to force interaction, and finally a person in apparent distress to appeal to basic human decency. It was a predator who understood human psychology and used it against his victims. I think about Sarah Chen sometimes, and I wonder if she went through the same sequence of events I did. Did she see the suitcase and decide to move it? Did she stop to check on the abandoned truck? Or did she encounter the man first and never had a chance to see the other warning signs? The police told me that my phone call probably saved other lives. They increased patrols in the area and issued warnings about the tactics being used. But they also told me something that still gives me chills. This wasn't the first time they'd seen this kind of elaborate setup. There were similar cases in other states, suggesting this might have been the work of someone who traveled around, specifically targeting people on remote roads. I never drove those back roads alone at night again, and I never ignored my gut instinct about a situation feeling wrong. Sometimes being paranoid and rude can save your life. Sometimes the person asking for help isn't the victim, they're the predator. I'm 32 years old and I've been driving trucks for about 8 years now. I work for a mid-sized logistics company that handles deliveries across the Pacific Northwest. It's not the most glamorous job, but it pays well, and I actually enjoy the solitude of long-distance driving. There's something peaceful about being on the road, just you and the highway, watching the landscape change as you move from state to state. This particular incident happened in December, right before Christmas. The weather had been unpredictable all week. One day it would be clear and dry, the next we'd get hit with snow or freezing rain. As a trucker, you learn to adapt to whatever Mother Nature throws at you, but winter driving always requires extra caution and attention. I'd picked up a load in Seattle that needed to be delivered to a distribution center in Spokane. It was a routine run that I'd done dozens of times before. The cargo was nothing special, just consumer electronics heading to retail stores for the holiday rush. I left Seattle around 6 p.m., planning to drive through the night and arrive in Spokane by morning. The first few hours went smoothly. Traffic was light once I got out of the city, and the roads were in decent condition. I made good time through the mountain passes, and by 11 p.m. I was ready for my first scheduled break. I pulled into a small truck stop called Mountain View Travel Plaza. It wasn't much to look at, just a basic building with restrooms, a small convenience store, and a few parking spaces for trucks. But it was clean, well lit, and served decent coffee. I parked my rig and went inside to use the facilities and grab a cup of coffee. The place was pretty quiet, which was normal for a weeknight. There were maybe 2 other trucks in the lot and a handful of cars belonging to late-night travelers. I bought my coffee, used the restroom, and headed back outside. As I walked back to my truck, I noticed a man standing near the back of the building. The lighting was dim in that area, but I could make out his silhouette. He was leaning against the wall, and it looked like he was staring in my direction. At first, I thought maybe he was just taking a smoke break or making a phone call, but something about his posture seemed off. He wasn't moving around or doing anything, just standing there, watching. I got back in my cab and took a moment to drink my coffee and check my route. The truck stop had Wi-Fi, so I used the opportunity to send a quick text to my wife, letting her know I was making good progress. As I sat there, I glanced toward the back of the building again. The man was still there, still in the same position, still looking in my direction. Now my truck was the only one parked in that section of the lot. There wasn't anything else for him to be looking at. The other trucks were parked on the opposite side of the building, and there were no other vehicles near me. It was definitely weird, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was waiting for someone, or maybe he was just zoned out and not really looking at anything in particular. I finished my coffee and decided it was time to get back on the road. I had another 4 hours of driving ahead of me, and I wanted to stay on schedule. As I started up the truck and pulled out of the parking lot, I checked my mirrors one more time. The man was still there, still watching as I drove away. The next stretch of highway was completely empty. It was now past midnight, and most sensible people were home in bed. Snow had started to fall lightly, not enough to be dangerous, but enough to make the road surface slick. I kept my speed reasonable and focused on the road ahead. About 30 minutes into this leg of the journey, I noticed a brief flash of light in my side mirror. It was just for a split second, like a reflection or a glint of something metallic. I kept checking my mirrors, thinking it might be another vehicle approaching from behind, but I couldn't see anything. The road behind me was completely dark. I figured it was probably just a reflector on the road or maybe a piece of debris that had caught my headlights at just the right angle. Winter roads are full of that kind of stuff. Broken glass, metal fragments from tire blowouts, reflective road markers that have come loose. I didn't think much of it and continued driving. The snow was getting heavier now, and I had to reduce my speed even more. Visibility was decreasing, and I needed to be extra careful on the curves and hills. For the next hour or so, I was completely focused on the road conditions and didn't pay much attention to anything else. Then I saw that flash of light again, this time more clearly. It was definitely coming from behind my trailer, and it looked like the reflection of headlights. But when I checked my mirrors, I still couldn't see any vehicle back there. The road appeared to be empty. I started paying closer attention to my mirrors, and that's when I realized what was happening. There was a car following me, but it was positioned directly behind my trailer, so close that it was completely hidden in my blind spot. The only time I could see it was when it drifted slightly to one side or the other, and my headlights would reflect off its windshield or headlights. This was extremely dangerous behavior. Following that close to a semi-truck is basically suicidal, especially in winter conditions. If I had to brake suddenly, the car would slam right into the back of my trailer. And why were their headlights turned off? That made no sense at all. I tried to figure out what they were doing. Maybe they were trying to draft behind me to save fuel, though that was incredibly stupid and dangerous. Or maybe they were just inexperienced drivers who didn't understand how to safely share the road with trucks. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this had to be intentional. No one accidentally follows a truck that closely with their lights off. I decided to test my theory. I moved into the left lane, as if I was going to pass another vehicle. Sure enough, the car followed me. I moved back to the right lane, and they moved with me. There was no doubt about it now. They were deliberately following me, staying hidden in my blind spot. This was starting to freak me out. I thought about the man I'd seen at the truck stop, the one who'd been watching me. Could this be the same person? Had he followed me from the truck stop? But that was over an hour ago, and I'd been maintaining highway speeds the whole time. How could he have kept up without me noticing? I tried to get a better look at the vehicle, but it was impossible from my position. All I could see were occasional glimpses when they moved slightly out of position. It appeared to be a dark-colored sedan, but I couldn't make out any other details. I considered calling the police, but I wasn't sure what to tell them. A car was following me? That wasn't necessarily illegal, even if it was dangerous. And I was in the middle of nowhere. It would take a long time for any law enforcement to reach my location. Instead, I decided to try to lose them. I gradually increased my speed, pushing the limits of what was safe given the road conditions. The car stayed with me. I tried changing lanes more frequently, hoping to shake them loose or at least get them to reveal themselves. But they matched my every move, staying hidden behind my trailer. Finally, I had an idea. I moved into the left lane and then suddenly slowed down significantly, as if I was having mechanical problems. This forced the car to either slow down with me or pass me. They chose to slow down, but in doing so, they fell back far enough that I could finally see them clearly in my mirrors. It was a dark blue or black sedan, maybe 10 years old. I couldn't see the license plate clearly, but I could make out the silhouette of a single person in the driver's seat. As soon as they realized I could see them, they dropped back even further and eventually disappeared from view entirely. I was relieved to have them off my tail, but I was also more confused than ever. What had they been trying to accomplish? Were they planning to rob me, attack me, or were they just some weirdo who got their kicks from following trucks? I continued driving for another 2 hours without incident. The snow had stopped and the roads were clearing up. I was starting to think the whole thing was over when I reached my planned rest stop for the night. It was a small roadside rest area, nothing fancy, just a parking area with picnic tables and restrooms. There was no building, no services, just a place where drivers could pull off and get some sleep. I'd used this spot many times before. It was quiet, safe, and usually empty during the overnight hours. I pulled into the rest area and parked my truck. I was exhausted from the stress of the last few hours, and I needed to get some sleep before completing the final leg of my journey. I set my alarm for 6 a.m., reclined my seat, and closed my eyes. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep when something woke me up. It wasn't a sound exactly, more like a feeling that something was wrong. I opened my eyes slowly, trying to orient myself. The cab was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the highway lights in the distance. I was about to close my eyes again when I saw movement outside my passenger window. I turned my head slightly and found myself staring directly into the face of a man pressed against the glass. He was maybe 2 feet away from me, his face clearly visible in the dim light. It was the same man I'd seen at the truck stop hours earlier. I was sure of it. Same build, same facial features, same unsettling stare. He was looking directly at me with wide, unblinking eyes that seemed almost excited, like he was enjoying my shock and fear. I nearly jumped out of my skin. My heart started pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The man didn't move or react to my obvious terror. He just kept staring at me with that disturbing expression. I reached for my door handle, thinking I needed to get out and confront him, but then I remembered I was dealing with someone who had been stalking me for hours. This wasn't a random encounter. This was someone who had followed me across multiple counties, waited for me to fall asleep, and then approached my truck in the middle of the night. Instead of getting out, I started my engine and turned on my lights. The man finally moved, stepping back from the window, but he didn't run away. He walked calmly around to the front of my truck and tried the driver's side door. When he found it locked, he tried the passenger door. Then he walked around to the back of the trailer as if he was looking for another way in. I grabbed my CB radio and called for help on the emergency channel. Within minutes, I heard the sound of a car engine starting up somewhere nearby. I looked around and saw headlights moving in the distance. The same car that had been following me earlier was parked behind a cluster of trees at the far end of the rest area. The car pulled out quickly and drove away, but not before I got a better look at it. It was definitely the same vehicle that had been tailgating me, and I was able to get a partial license plate number. I stayed on the radio with other truckers in the area until a state trooper arrived about 20 minutes later. I gave him a full report of everything that had happened, from the man at the truck stop to the stalking behavior on the highway to the confrontation at the rest area. The trooper took my statement seriously and put out a BOLO alert for the vehicle. He also contacted the truck stop where I'd first seen the man and requested their security footage. Unfortunately, the car was never found, and the man was never identified. But the investigation did reveal something disturbing. The truck stop's security cameras showed the man watching me from the moment I arrived. He'd been there for over an hour before I showed up, just waiting. And after I left, he immediately got in his car and followed me. The police believed this wasn't random. They thought he might have been targeting truck drivers specifically, possibly looking for opportunities to rob them or steal their cargo. The fact that he'd followed me for so long and then approached my truck while I was sleeping suggested he was planning something more serious than just harassment. I never found out what his ultimate plan was, and honestly, I'm glad I didn't. The whole experience taught me to trust my instincts and to take unusual behavior seriously, even when it seems harmless at first. That man at the truck stop wasn't just taking a break or waiting for someone. He was hunting. I still drive the same routes, but I'm much more aware of my surroundings now. I vary my stops, I check my mirrors more frequently, and I never ignore that feeling when something doesn't seem right. Because sometimes the person watching you isn't just curious, they're planning something terrible. I was 16 years old and had just gotten my first real job at Tony's Pizza, a small family-owned restaurant in my hometown of Cedar Falls. It wasn't glamorous work, but I was excited to finally have some independence and my own money. I'd been working there for about 6 months, mostly doing prep work in the kitchen and helping with orders during busy periods. The thing I really wanted to do was deliveries. The delivery drivers made better money with tips, and more importantly, they got to drive around instead of being stuck in a hot kitchen all evening. But there was one problem. I didn't have a car. My parents had promised to help me buy one if I could save up half the money myself, and after 6 months of working every shift I could get, I finally had enough. It was a 1998 Honda Civic with about 150,000 miles on it. The paint was faded, the interior was worn, and it made some concerning noises when you started it up, but it ran reliably, and it was mine. More importantly, it meant I could finally start doing deliveries and making real money. My manager, Tony Jr., was happy to move me to delivery duty. He'd been short-staffed on drivers for months, and having another person available meant he could take more orders and extend the delivery radius. The job was pretty straightforward. Take the orders, follow the GPS, collect the money, and try to be friendly enough to earn decent tips. This particular incident happened on a Tuesday night in March. It was one of those quiet weeknights where business was slow, and I was hoping to get out early. I'd gotten to work at 5 p.m. after school, and by 8 p.m. we'd only had a handful of delivery orders. Most of our business that night was walk-in customers picking up their own orders. I was in the back folding pizza boxes when Tony Jr. called out that we had a delivery order. It was an online order for 2 medium pizzas, 1 pepperoni and one Supreme. The address was in Oakwood Estates, a newer subdivision about 15 minutes away. I'd delivered there a few times before, and it was always an easy run. Nice neighborhood, good tips, well-lit streets. I loaded the pizzas into the insulated delivery bag, grabbed the receipt, and headed out to my car. The order total was $28.50, which meant I was hoping for at least a $5 tip to make the drive worthwhile. The customer had paid online with a credit card, so all I had to do was deliver the food and hopefully collect a cash tip. The drive started out completely normal. It was about 8:30 p.m., so it was dark, but not late enough for the roads to be empty. There were a few other cars around, people heading home from work or going out for dinner. I had my music playing and was looking forward to an easy delivery. About 5 minutes into the drive, I noticed a car pull out from a side street behind me. It was a dark-colored sedan, maybe a Toyota or Honda, and it fell in behind me at a normal distance. I didn't think anything of it at first. It's a free country, and people can drive wherever they want. But as I continued toward the subdivision, the car stayed behind me. When I turned left onto Maple Street, it turned left. When I turned right onto Oak Avenue, it turned right. By the time I was approaching the entrance to Oakwood Estates, I was starting to wonder if it was just a coincidence. I mean, it was entirely possible that someone else was heading to the same neighborhood. Oakwood Estates was a popular area with young families, and there were probably 100 houses in there. The chances that another driver would be going to the same general area weren't that slim. I turned into the subdivision and checked my rearview mirror. Sure enough, the sedan's headlights appeared behind me a few seconds later. Now I was paying closer attention. The subdivision had several different streets branching off from the main road, so if this was just a coincidence, the car would probably turn off soon to go to its own destination. I followed my GPS directions deeper into the neighborhood. The houses here were all fairly new, built in the last 10 years, with well-maintained lawns and 2-car garages. It was the kind of place where young professionals and growing families moved when they wanted good schools and safe streets. The car was still behind me. I made another turn, then another, following the GPS toward the delivery address. Each time, the sedan followed. By now I was getting a little creeped out, but I tried to stay rational about it. Maybe they were lost and were following me because they thought I knew where I was going. Maybe they were visiting someone in the neighborhood and weren't familiar with the street layout. Finally, my GPS announced that I'd reached my destination. I pulled up to the house and checked the address against my receipt. 1247 Birch Lane. This was definitely the right place. I looked in my rearview mirror and saw the sedan slow down as it passed the house, then continue down the street. I felt a wave of relief. See? It was just a coincidence. They were probably going to visit someone a few streets over, or maybe they were just cutting through the neighborhood to get to another part of town. I was being paranoid for no reason. I grabbed the pizza bag and walked up to the front door. The house was a nice 2-story colonial with a well-lit front porch. There were lights on inside, which was a good sign. Nothing worse than delivering to a house where everyone's asleep and you have to wake them up. I rang the doorbell and waited. After about 30 seconds, I heard footsteps inside and saw a light come on in the front hallway. The door opened and I found myself face to face with a woman in her early 30s. She was wearing a bathrobe and looked like she'd been getting ready for bed. "Hi, I have a pizza delivery for this address," I said, reading the address off my receipt to make sure I was in the right place. The woman looked confused. "I'm sorry, but I didn't order any pizza. Are you sure you have the right address?" I double-checked the receipt. 1247 Birch Lane, right? 2 medium pizzas, 1 pepperoni, and 1 supreme? She shook her head. "No, I definitely didn't order anything. I was just about to go to bed. You must have the wrong house." This was weird. I'd been doing deliveries for a few months now, and I'd never had a situation where the address was completely wrong. Usually, if there was a mistake, it was just a matter of being off by a house number or two. But this woman seemed genuinely confused and a little annoyed about being bothered. "I'm really sorry about this," I said. "Let me call the restaurant and see what happened." I pulled out my phone to call Tony Jr., But then I realized I had a problem. The customer had paid online with a credit card, which meant I didn't have a phone number to call them directly. And the online ordering system sometimes had glitches where addresses got mixed up or entered incorrectly. "Don't worry about it," the woman said. "These things happen. I hope you figure it out." She closed the door, and I was left standing on the porch with 2 pizzas and no idea where they were supposed to go. I walked back toward my car, feeling frustrated and a little embarrassed. This was going to be a pain to sort out, and I probably wasn't going to get a tip for my trouble. As I approached my car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The sedan that had been following me was parked directly behind my Honda, blocking me in. Its headlights were off, but I could see the exhaust coming from the tailpipe, which meant the engine was still running. I stopped walking and tried to think. Maybe they lived here too and were just parking in the street. Maybe they were visiting someone and had parked behind me by coincidence. But something about the situation felt very wrong. I stood there for probably 30 seconds, waiting to see if anyone would get out of the car or if it would move. Nothing happened. The car just sat there, idling, with someone inside watching me. I decided to get in my car and see what would happen. Maybe if I started my engine and put it in reverse, they'd realize they were blocking me and move out of the way. I opened my door, put the pizzas on the passenger seat, and started the engine. The sedan didn't move. I put my car in reverse and backed up slightly, hoping to signal that I needed to get out. The sedan still didn't move. I was starting to panic now. This wasn't a coincidence or a misunderstanding. Someone had deliberately followed me to this address and was now blocking my exit. I tried to think of what to do. I could get out and ask them to move, but that would mean approaching a car full of strangers who had been following me. I could honk my horn, but that might wake up the whole neighborhood, and I wasn't sure I wanted to cause a scene if this was all some kind of misunderstanding. Then I had an idea. The driveway was wide enough that I might be able to turn around and drive across the lawn to get back to the street. It would probably damage the grass, but if I was really in danger, I figured the homeowner would understand. I put the car in drive and started to turn around in the driveway. As I did, I saw the doors of the sedan open. 4 men got out of the car. They were all wearing dark clothing, hoodies and baseball caps that obscured their faces. One of them had his hand inside his hoodie pocket, like he was holding something. That's when I knew for certain that I was in serious trouble. The men started walking toward my car, not running, but moving with purpose. I gunned the engine and tried to drive around them, but the driveway wasn't wide enough. My right wheels went off the pavement and into the soft dirt of the flower bed. The car lurched and skidded, and before I knew it, I'd crashed into a small, decorative tree. The impact wasn't hard enough to deploy the airbags, but it was enough to stop the car. I could hear the men shouting to each other, and I saw one of them running toward my driver's side door. I didn't wait to see what they wanted. I threw open my door and ran. I sprinted across the front yard and into the street, then cut between 2 houses and kept running. Behind me, I could hear at least one of them chasing me, yelling for the others to follow, but I was 16 and in decent shape from playing soccer, and I had adrenaline on my side. I ran through backyards, jumping fences and dodging around swing sets and garden sheds. I could hear my pursuer falling behind, and eventually the shouting stopped. I kept running until I reached a main road, then ducked behind a gas station and called 911. The police response was quick and professional. They found my car still crashed into the tree, but the sedan and the 4 men were long gone. The pizzas were still sitting on my passenger seat, getting cold. The investigation revealed that the whole thing had been an elaborate setup. The online pizza order had been placed using a stolen credit card, and the address had been chosen specifically because it was in a quiet residential area with limited escape routes. The plan was apparently to lure a delivery driver to the location, trap them, and then rob them. What they intended to do beyond robbery, I never found out, and honestly, I don't want to know. The fact that there were 4 of them and they'd gone to such elaborate lengths to set up the trap suggests they had something more serious in mind than just taking my money. My car was totaled, not from the crash, but because the police found evidence that the men had tried to break into it after I ran. They'd smashed the windows and damaged the interior, probably looking for money or anything else of value. The scariest part was learning that this wasn't an isolated incident. The police told me there had been similar cases in other cities, always targeting pizza delivery drivers, always using fake online orders to lure victims to predetermined locations. It was apparently a growing trend among criminals who had figured out that delivery drivers were easy targets, young, often alone, carrying cash, and required to go to specific addresses. I never went back to delivery driving after that. Tony Jr. was understanding and moved me back to kitchen work, but honestly, the whole experience had shaken me up so badly that I quit a few weeks later. Every time I heard the phone ring with a delivery order, I'd think about those 4 men and wonder if someone else was about to walk into the same trap. The men were never caught, and my car was never recovered. The insurance payout was enough to buy another used car, but I was much more careful about where I drove and when. I never again took for granted that a routine trip could turn dangerous in a matter of seconds. Looking back, I realize how lucky I was. If I hadn't noticed the car following me, if I hadn't been suspicious enough to pay attention to my surroundings, if I hadn't been fast enough to run when things went bad, I might not be here to tell this story. Sometimes being paranoid and running away is the smartest thing you can do. I was 29 years old and working as a regional sales manager for a medical equipment company. My territory covered most of the southeastern United States, which meant I spent a lot of time driving between cities, visiting hospitals and clinics to demonstrate our products. It wasn't unusual for me to put 500 miles on my car in a single day, and I'd gotten comfortable with long stretches of highway driving. This happened on a Thursday night in September. I'd spent the day in Atlanta meeting with procurement managers at 3 different hospitals, trying to secure contracts for our new line of diagnostic equipment. The meetings had run later than expected, and by the time I finished my last appointment, it was already 7 p.m. I had 2 choices: find a hotel in Atlanta and drive home to Charlotte the next morning, or make the 4-hour drive that night and sleep in my own bed. I was tired, but I had an early morning meeting on Friday that I couldn't reschedule, so I decided to push through and drive home. The first hour of the drive was fine. I grabbed a large coffee and some energy bars from a gas station, cranked up the air conditioning, and settled in for the long haul. Interstate 85 between Atlanta and Charlotte is a route I'd driven dozens of times, and I knew every rest stop and exit along the way. By 9 p.m., I was making good time and feeling alert. The coffee was working, traffic was light, and I was looking forward to being home by 11. I was listening to a podcast about business strategy and actually enjoying the quiet drive through the Georgia countryside. That's when I saw the first stranded motorist. It was a woman standing beside a small SUV on the shoulder of the highway. Her hazard lights were blinking, and she was waving at passing cars, clearly trying to get someone to stop and help. She looked to be in her 40s, professionally dressed, and appeared genuinely distressed. My first instinct was to pull over and offer assistance. I'd been in similar situations myself, and I knew how frustrating and scary it could be to be stranded on a dark highway. But something made me hesitate. Maybe it was the fact that she was a woman alone at night, and I was a man she didn't know. Maybe it was just that I was tired and wanted to get home. Whatever the reason, I slowed down but didn't stop. As I passed her, I grabbed my phone and called 911 to report the stranded motorist. The dispatcher thanked me and said they'd send someone to check on her. I felt better knowing that help was on the way, even if I hadn't stopped myself. About 20 minutes later, I encountered another stranded vehicle. This time, it was a pickup truck with its hood up, and a man in work clothes was standing beside it, looking at the engine. He also tried to flag me down, but again, something didn't feel right. 2 broken-down vehicles in 20 minutes on the same stretch of highway seemed like an unusual coincidence. I called 911 again to report the second stranded motorist. The dispatcher seemed surprised that I was calling about another breakdown so soon after the first one, but she took the information and promised to send assistance. 10 minutes after that, I saw a third vehicle on the shoulder. This time, it was a sedan with a flat tire, and there were two people standing beside it, a man and a woman who appeared to be a couple. They were both waving frantically at passing cars, and the woman was holding what looked like a cell phone, probably trying to call for help. Now, I was really suspicious. 3 breakdowns in 30 minutes, all on the same stretch of highway, all with people desperately trying to flag down passing motorists. That wasn't a coincidence. That was a pattern. I didn't call 911 this time. Instead, I called my wife to let her know what was happening and to ask her to stay on the phone with me for the rest of the drive. I figured if something happened to me, at least she'd know where I was and could send help. "That's really weird," she said when I described the situation. "Are you sure they're not just having a run of bad luck on that stretch of road?" 3 separate breakdowns in half an hour, I replied, and they're all perfectly spaced out, like someone planned it that way. I think someone's trying to get drivers to stop. My wife agreed that it sounded suspicious and promised to stay on the line with me. Having her voice in my ear made me feel less alone and more alert to potential danger. About 5 minutes later, I saw why I'd been right to be suspicious. There was a 4th stranded vehicle ahead, a minivan with its hazard lights on. But this time, instead of just 1 or 2 people trying to flag down help, there were 4 men standing around the vehicle. They weren't dressed like a family having car trouble. They were all wearing dark clothing, and they seemed to be positioned strategically around the van. As I approached, one of them stepped into the travel lane and started waving his arms aggressively, trying to force me to stop. The others moved to block both shoulders, making it difficult for me to go around them. "Something's definitely wrong," I told my wife. "There are 4 guys trying to block the road." "Don't stop," she said immediately. "Get out of there!" I swerved into the left lane and accelerated past them. As I did, I could see them clearly in my headlights. They weren't distressed motorists. They were young men who looked angry that I hadn't stopped. One of them actually ran after my car for a few steps, shouting something I couldn't hear over the engine noise. In my rearview mirror, I watched them get back into the minivan and start following me. Their broken-down vehicle started up immediately and began pursuing me down the highway. "They're following me now," I told my wife, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "The van is chasing me." "How fast are you going?" she asked. "About 80, and I'm going to go faster." I pushed my car up to 90 miles per hour, then 95. The minivan kept pace with me for a few miles, but eventually it fell back and disappeared from view. Either they'd given up, or they'd realized that a high-speed chase on the interstate was too risky. I stayed on the phone with my wife for the rest of the drive, and I didn't encounter any more stranded motorists. When I finally reached Charlotte, I went straight to the police station to file a report. The officer who took my statement was very interested in what I'd seen. He told me that there had been several reports of highway robberies in that area over the past few months, all following the same pattern. Groups of criminals would stage fake breakdowns to get drivers to stop, then rob them at gunpoint. "You did the right thing by not stopping," he said. "We've had 3 victims in the past 2 months who weren't so lucky. They stopped to help and ended up losing their wallets, phones, and cars." The officer explained that this was a growing trend among highway criminals. They'd learned that most people are naturally helpful and will stop to assist someone who appears to be in distress. The criminals would use this basic human decency against their victims. "The really scary part," he continued, "is that we think some of these groups are getting more violent. The last victim was hospitalized with a concussion after he tried to resist. We're worried that someone's going to get killed." The police increased patrols on that stretch of I-85, and within a week, they'd arrested a group of 5 men who matched the description I'd given. They were found with multiple cell phones, wallets, and other items that had been stolen from highway robbery victims. It turned out that the group had been operating for months, using the fake breakdown scheme to target lone drivers. They'd stolen over $20,000 in cash and property, and they'd assaulted several victims who tried to resist. The most disturbing part was learning how organized they were. They had specific roles. Some would act as the stranded motorists. Others would hide nearby to surround victims once they stopped, and one would always be ready to pursue anyone who didn't fall for the trap. They'd also been studying traffic patterns to identify the best locations and times for their scheme. They knew that certain stretches of highway were isolated enough that victims couldn't easily escape, and they timed their operations for late evening when there were fewer witnesses around. What haunts me is thinking about how close I came to becoming a victim. If I'd stopped for that first woman, I would have been surrounded by criminals before I realized what was happening. If I'd been less suspicious about the pattern of breakdowns, I might have eventually stopped to help someone and walked right into their trap. The experience completely changed how I approach highway driving. I still want to help people in genuine distress, but I'm much more cautious about stopping for strangers, especially at night. If I see someone who appears to need help, I call 911 instead of stopping myself. I also learned to trust my instincts when something doesn't feel right. The pattern of multiple breakdowns should have been an obvious red flag, but it would have been easy to dismiss as coincidence if I hadn't been paying attention. The criminals were eventually sentenced to several years in prison, but I know there are other groups out there using similar tactics. Highway robbery is a crime that's hard to prevent because it exploits people's natural desire to help others. Now, when I drive long distances, especially at night, I stay alert for anything that seems suspicious or too coincidental, because sometimes the person who appears to need help is actually the one you need help getting away from. I was 26 years old and working as a freelance graphic designer. Most of my clients were on the West Coast, but I lived in Denver because I loved the mountains and the cost of living was more reasonable. This meant I often had to travel to California for client meetings, and I'd gotten into the habit of driving instead of flying because it was cheaper and I could write off the mileage. This particular trip was in late October. I had meetings scheduled in Los Angeles on Monday and Tuesday, so I decided to drive out on Sunday to avoid the stress of flying early Monday morning. The drive from Denver to LA is about 1,100 miles, and I'd done it enough times that I had my routine down. I'd leave early Sunday morning, drive straight through with minimal stops, and arrive in LA by evening. I left Denver at 6 a.m., planning to reach Los Angeles by 8 p.m. The first few hours went smoothly. Clear weather, light traffic, and good music to keep me company. I made my usual stops in Grand Junction, Colorado, and Moab, Utah for gas and food. By 2 p.m. I was crossing into Nevada, and that's when the landscape really opens up. Long stretches of desert highway with nothing but sagebrush and mountains in the distance. It's beautiful in its own way, but it can also be monotonous and hypnotic, especially when you're tired. I was about an hour outside of Las Vegas when I first noticed something odd. In my peripheral vision, I caught a glimpse of someone walking alongside the highway. This wasn't unusual by itself. Sometimes you see hitchhikers or people whose cars have broken down. But when I looked directly at the spot where I thought I'd seen the person, there was nothing there. I figured I was just tired and seeing things. I'd been driving for 8 hours straight, and the desert heat creates mirages that can play tricks on your eyes. I turned up the air conditioning, took a sip of my energy drink, and kept driving. About 10 minutes later, I saw it again. This time it was more distinct, a figure walking parallel to my car, maybe 50 feet off the highway. The person appeared to be keeping pace with me, which was impossible since I was doing 75 miles per hour. When I looked directly at the spot, again, there was nothing there. This was starting to creep me out. I'd heard that extreme fatigue could cause hallucinations, and I wondered if I needed to pull over and take a nap. But I was making good time and really wanted to reach LA before dark. I decided to push through and just be more careful about staying alert. The next time I saw the figure, it was closer to the road, and this time when I looked directly at it, it didn't disappear immediately. For just a split second, I could see what looked like a person in dark clothing walking alongside my car. Then it vanished. I was definitely hallucinating now. I'd read about this happening to long-distance drivers. Your brain starts filling in details that aren't really there, especially when you're staring at the same monotonous landscape for hours. The smart thing to do would be to pull over and rest, but I was stubborn and wanted to finish the drive. I stopped in Las Vegas for gas and took a 20-minute break, walking around the gas station and splashing cold water on my face. I felt more alert afterward and convinced myself that the hallucinations had just been a temporary result of fatigue. Back on the road, I felt better for the first hour. The landscape was changing as I headed into California, and having something different to look at helped keep my mind focused. But as the sun started to set and the desert grew darker, the figure appeared again. This time it was much closer to the road, maybe 20 feet from my car, and it was definitely keeping pace with me. I could see it clearly in my peripheral vision, a person in dark clothing walking with a steady, purposeful stride. When I turned to look directly at it, it faded but didn't disappear completely. I was really scared now. This wasn't just fatigue. Something was seriously wrong with my perception. I considered pulling over and calling someone, but I was in the middle of nowhere with no cell service. The nearest town was probably 50 miles away. I decided to keep driving, but to be extra careful. I slowed down to 65 miles per hour and kept both hands firmly on the wheel. I tried not to look at the figure, but it was impossible to ignore. It was always there in my peripheral vision, walking alongside my car like some kind of shadow. As I approached Barstow, California, I needed to stop for gas again. I pulled into a brightly lit truck stop, grateful to be around other people and normal activity. I filled up my tank and went inside to buy another energy drink and use the restroom. While I was inside, I struck up a conversation with the cashier, a friendly older woman who seemed to know all the regular travelers. "You look tired, honey," she said. "How far are you driving tonight?" "Just to LA," I replied, "but I've been seeing things on the road. I think I need to take a break." Her expression changed immediately. "What kind of things?" "Like someone walking alongside my car. I know it's not real, but it's really freaking me out." The woman looked at me seriously. What did this person look like? I described the figure I'd been seeing. Dark clothing, walking with purpose, always keeping pace with my car. The woman nodded grimly. "You're not the first person to tell me about seeing that," she said. "We get drivers in here maybe once a month who describe the exact same thing, always on that stretch of highway between Vegas and here." "So it's a common hallucination?" I asked, feeling somewhat relieved. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe it's something else. There was a hitchhiker killed on that stretch of road about 10 years ago, hit and run, never solved. Some people think his spirit still walks that highway." I didn't believe in ghosts, but the woman's story was unsettling. Whether it was a hallucination or something supernatural, I clearly wasn't the only person who'd experienced it. I bought a large coffee and decided to push through to LA. I only had about 2 hours of driving left, and I figured I could handle it if I stayed focused and didn't let the figure distract me. Back on the highway, the figure appeared almost immediately, but now that I knew other people had seen it too, I was less afraid and more curious. I tried to get a better look at it without taking my eyes completely off the road. The figure appeared to be a man, maybe in his 30s, wearing what looked like a denim jacket and jeans. He had dark hair and was walking with a slight limp, as if he'd been injured. He never looked at my car directly, just kept walking parallel to the highway with that steady, determined pace. As I got closer to the outskirts of LA, the figure began to fade. By the time I reached the city limits, it was gone completely. I drove the rest of the way to my hotel without seeing it again. The next morning, I did some research online about the highway between Las Vegas and Barstow. I found several forum posts from drivers who described seeing the exact same figure I'd encountered. Some thought it was a hallucination caused by fatigue and the monotonous desert landscape. Others believed it was paranormal. I also found a news article from 2014 about a hitchhiker named David Martinez who'd been killed in a hit-and-run accident on that stretch of highway. The description matched what I'd seen, a man in his 30s wearing a denim jacket. His body had been found about 50 feet from the road, and the driver who killed him was never identified. I don't know if what I saw was a hallucination, a ghost, or something else entirely. But I do know that I wasn't the only person to experience it, and that makes it feel more real somehow. Maybe David Martinez is still trying to get a ride, still walking that lonely stretch of highway where he died. I've driven that route several times since then, and I always see the figure. It's become almost routine. Somewhere between Vegas and Barstow, he appears in my peripheral vision and walks alongside my car for an hour or so. I'm not scared of him anymore. If anything, I feel sorry for him. Whether he's real or not, he seems trapped on that highway, endlessly walking toward a destination he'll never reach. And maybe that's the most frightening thing of all. Not that the dead might still be among us, but that they might be just as lost and lonely as they were in life. I always make sure to drive carefully on that stretch of road now, not because I'm afraid of the figure, but because I don't want to end up walking alongside him forever. I was 34 years old and working as a pharmaceutical sales representative covering a territory that included most of rural Montana. It was a job that required a lot of driving through some pretty remote areas, visiting small-town doctors and clinics to promote our company's medications. I'd been doing it for about 3 years and had gotten comfortable navigating the back roads and mountain highways. This particular incident happened in early November. I had a series of appointments scheduled in the northwestern part of the state, near the Canadian border. It was an area I didn't visit often, maybe twice a year, so I wasn't as familiar with the roads as I was in other parts of my territory. I'd finished my last appointment of the day in a small town called Shelby around 4 p.m. My plan was to drive to Great Falls, where I had a hotel reservation, and then continue to Billings the next morning for more meetings. The drive from Shelby to Great Falls was supposed to take about 2 hours on Highway 2, a route I'd driven before. But as I was leaving Shelby, I noticed that construction had closed a section of Highway 2. There were detour signs directing traffic onto a series of county roads that would eventually reconnect with the main highway. I'd encountered similar situations before, and while detours were annoying, they were usually well marked and straightforward to follow. I followed the detour signs for about 20 minutes, driving through typical Montana countryside, rolling hills, scattered ranches, and the occasional small town. The roads were paved but narrow, clearly not designed for heavy traffic. I passed a few other vehicles that were also following the detour, which made me feel confident I was going the right way. Then I came to a fork in the road where the detour signs seemed to have ended. There was no indication of which way to go to get back to Highway 2. I pulled over and checked my GPS, but the signal was weak and the map wasn't loading properly. This was a common problem in rural Montana, where cell towers were sparse and GPS coverage was spotty. I decided to take the road that seemed to head in the general direction of Great Falls, figuring I could always turn around if it didn't work out. The road was still paved, and it looked like it had been recently maintained, so I assumed it was a legitimate route. For the first half hour, everything seemed fine. The road wound through some beautiful countryside with views of distant mountains and vast open spaces. I passed a few farmhouses and ranch entrances, signs of normal rural life. But gradually, the road began to deteriorate. The pavement became cracked and patched, and the shoulders were overgrown with weeds. I was starting to think I'd made a wrong turn when I came to a small town that wasn't on any of my maps. It was just a cluster of maybe 20 buildings, a few houses, what looked like an old general store, and a gas station that appeared to be closed. There were no street signs or town markers, and the place had an abandoned, forgotten feel to it. I pulled over in front of the general store and tried my GPS again. Still no signal. I was definitely lost, but I figured I could ask for directions if I could find someone around. I got out of my car and walked up to the general store, but the windows were boarded up, and there was a closed sign that looked like it had been there for years. As I was walking back to my car, I noticed a man sitting on the porch of one of the houses across the street. He was elderly, maybe in his 70s, wearing overalls and a flannel shirt. He was just sitting there, staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Excuse me," I called out. "I'm trying to get to Great Falls. Can you tell me which way I should go?" The man didn't respond immediately. He just kept staring at me with those unsettling eyes. Finally, he spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "I'm sorry, I'm just lost. I took a detour, and I think I made a wrong turn somewhere." "You need to leave," he said, his voice a little louder now. "Right now." There was something in his tone that made me very uncomfortable. He wasn't being helpful or friendly. He seemed genuinely frightened or angry about my presence. I decided not to push for directions and just get back in my car. "Okay, thanks anyway," I said, backing toward my vehicle. As I got in my car, I noticed that other people had appeared. There was a woman standing in the doorway of another house, and a man had emerged from behind the gas station. They were all staring at me with the same hostile expression. None of them said anything, but their body language was clear. I wasn't welcome here. I started my car and drove through the town as quickly as I could without speeding. In my rearview mirror, I could see the people standing in the street, watching me leave. The whole encounter had lasted maybe 5 minutes, but it felt much longer. Once I was out of the town, I continued down the road, hoping it would eventually connect with a highway I recognized. But instead of improving, the situation got worse. The road became increasingly rough and narrow, eventually turning into little more than a dirt track. I was clearly not on any official detour route. I was about to turn around when I saw headlights approaching from behind. It was a pickup truck, and it was coming up fast. I pulled over to let it pass, but instead of passing, it pulled up alongside me and stopped. The driver rolled down his window and motioned for me to do the same. He was a middle-aged man with a scraggly beard and suspicious eyes. When I cracked my window, he leaned out of his truck. "You lost?" he asked, but his tone wasn't friendly. It was more like an accusation. "Yeah, I took a detour and I think I made a wrong turn. I'm trying to get to Great Falls." "This road doesn't go to Great Falls," he said. "You need to turn around and go back where you came from." "Okay, thanks. Can you tell me how to get back to Highway 2? The man's expression hardened. "Just turn around and drive back the way you came. Keep driving until you're out of here." There was something threatening in his voice that made me very nervous. I thanked him and started to roll up my window, but he wasn't finished. "And don't come back," he said. "People around here don't like strangers poking around." I nodded and put my car in reverse, turning around in the narrow road. The pickup truck followed me for about a mile, staying close behind me like it was escorting me out of the area. Finally, it turned off onto a side road and disappeared. I drove back toward the strange little town, but when I reached the spot where it should have been, I couldn't find it. The road looked different somehow, and there was no sign of the buildings or people I'd encountered earlier. It was like the town had simply vanished. I was starting to panic now. I was completely lost. My GPS wasn't working, and I was running low on gas. I had no idea where I was or how to get back to civilization. The sun was setting, and the idea of being stranded in this remote area overnight was terrifying. I kept driving, following the road back in the direction I'd come from, hoping to eventually find the detour signs or some other indication of where I was. After about an hour of driving, I finally saw a sign for Highway 2. I'd never been so happy to see a familiar road marker. It turned out I'd been driving in a huge circle, somehow ending up about 50 miles from where I'd started. I made it to Great Falls around 10 p.m., 3 hours later than planned, exhausted and shaken by the experience. The next morning, I tried to research the area where I'd gotten lost. I looked at detailed maps and satellite images, trying to find the town I'd encountered, but I couldn't locate it anywhere. According to every map I checked, there was no town in that area, just empty countryside and abandoned mining claims. I asked some local people about the area, describing what I'd seen. Most of them had never heard of a town matching my description, but one older man at a gas station gave me a strange look when I mentioned it. "You talking about Millerville?" he asked. "I don't know what it was called. There were no signs." Millerville was a mining town that got abandoned back in the 1980s when the mine closed. Most of the buildings got torn down years ago. Ain't nothing there now but foundations and old roads. But I saw people there. I talked to them. The man shrugged. Maybe you saw some squatters or something. There's been talk of people living rough out in that area. Not the kind of folks you'd want to run into alone. That explanation made some sense, but it didn't account for how the town had seemed to disappear when I drove back through. And it didn't explain why my GPS had stopped working in that specific area. I never figured out exactly what happened that day. Maybe I encountered some kind of off-the-grid community that didn't want to be found. Maybe the stress and confusion of being lost had affected my perception of what I was seeing. Or maybe there was something more unusual going on. What I do know is that I never took another unmarked detour in rural Montana. I learned to carry paper maps as backup for my GPS, and I always made sure to have a full tank of gas before driving through remote areas. Because getting lost in the middle of nowhere is scary enough without encountering people who clearly don't want you there. I still drive through that part of Montana occasionally for work, but I always stick to the main highways now. And sometimes, when I'm driving through particularly remote areas, I wonder if there are other forgotten places out there, hidden communities that exist just off the beaten path, populated by people who have their own reasons for staying invisible. The thought that you can take one wrong turn and end up somewhere that doesn't officially exist is both fascinating and terrifying. It makes you realize how much of the world remains unmapped and unknown, even in an age of GPS and satellite imagery. I was 28 years old and working as a territory manager for a beverage distribution company. My job required me to visit retail stores and restaurants across a 3-state area, checking on our product displays and maintaining relationships with store managers. It meant a lot of driving, often through rural areas where our smaller accounts were located. This incident happened on a cold February night. I'd spent the day visiting accounts in small towns across northern Wisconsin, and I was driving back to my home base in Minneapolis. It was about a 6-hour drive, and I'd planned to be home by 10 p.m. But my last appointment had run late, and I didn't get on the road until after 6 p.m. The weather had been threatening snow all day, and by 8 p.m. it was coming down steadily. Not a blizzard, but enough to make driving treacherous, especially on the winding 2-lane highways that connected the small towns in that part of Wisconsin. I was driving my company car, a reliable Honda Accord, but even good cars can have problems in winter conditions. I was about 2 hours from Minneapolis, driving through a particularly remote stretch of highway, when I felt the car start to lose power. At first, I thought it might just be the snow affecting traction, but then the engine started making a strange knocking sound. Within minutes, the car was barely maintaining 30 miles per hour, and I could smell something burning. I managed to coast into a small town called Cedar Creek. It was the kind of place that probably had a population of maybe 500 people, with a main street that consisted of a few old buildings and not much else. Most of the businesses appeared to be closed for the night, and the streets were empty, except for my struggling car. I pulled into the parking lot of what looked like a closed diner and turned off the engine. When I tried to restart it, nothing happened. The engine was completely dead, and I was stranded in the middle of nowhere in a snowstorm. I tried calling AAA, but my cell phone had no signal. This was before smartphones were common, so I couldn't use GPS or look up local services online. I was going to have to find help the old-fashioned way. I got out of the car and looked around. Most of the buildings on the main street were dark, but I could see a light on in what appeared to be a gas station about a block away. I locked my car and walked through the snow toward the light, hoping someone there could help me, or at least let me use a phone. As I got closer, I could see that it was indeed a gas station, but it looked like it had been built in the 1960s and hadn't been updated since. The sign said Pete's Auto Service in faded letters, and there was a single-bay garage attached to the main building. A light was on inside the garage, and I could hear the sound of someone working. I knocked on the door of the main building, but no one answered. I walked around to the garage and knocked on that door. After a moment it opened, and I found myself face to face with a man in his 50s wearing greasy coveralls. "Help you?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "My car broke down," I explained. "It's parked over by the diner. The engine just died, and I can't get it started. Do you think you could take a look at it?" The man, who introduced himself as Pete, seemed friendly enough. He said he'd been working late on another repair job, but he could take a look at my car. He grabbed a toolbox and a flashlight, and we walked back to where I'd left the Honda. Pete popped the hood and spent about 10 minutes examining the engine with his flashlight. He poked around, checked various components, and even tried to start the car himself. Finally, he stood up and shook his head. "Looks like your timing belt snapped," he said. "That's what caused the knocking sound and the loss of power. It's not something you can fix on the side of the road." "Can you repair it?" I asked, dreading the answer. "I can, but I'll need to order the part. Won't be able to get it until tomorrow afternoon at the earliest. You're looking at staying overnight." This was not what I wanted to hear, but I didn't have much choice. I asked Pete if he knew of a motel in town where I could stay the night. "There's no motel here," he said. "Nearest one is about 40 miles away. But tell you what, I've got a cot in the back of my shop. You're welcome to sleep there if you don't mind roughing it a bit." I wasn't thrilled about the idea of sleeping in a garage, but it was better than trying to sleep in my broken-down car in a snowstorm. I thanked Pete for his offer and asked if I could at least call my wife to let her know what had happened. "Phone's inside," he said. "Come on, let's get your car towed into the garage so I can work on it properly in the morning." Pete had a small tow truck parked behind his garage. He hooked up my car and pulled it into the service bay. The garage was cluttered with tools, spare parts, and half-finished repair jobs, but it was warm and dry. There was indeed a cot set up in one corner, along with a small space heater. I used Pete's phone to call my wife and explain the situation. She wasn't happy about me being stranded, but she was relieved that I'd found help and had a place to stay. I promised to call her in the morning with an update. Pete showed me where the bathroom was and gave me a blanket for the cot. He said he was going to finish up the job he'd been working on and then head home, which was apparently just a few blocks away. He'd be back first thing in the morning to start working on my car. "Just make yourself comfortable," he said. "There's a coffee pot over there if you want some. I'll lock up when I leave, but the door will open from the inside if you need to get out for any reason." I thanked him again and settled in for what I expected to be an uncomfortable but manageable night. Pete worked for another hour or so, then cleaned up his tools and left, locking the garage door behind him. I tried to sleep, but the cot was lumpy and the garage was full of unfamiliar sounds, the building settling, the wind outside, the occasional car passing on the highway. Around midnight, I finally started to drift off. I was awakened sometime later by the sound of the garage door opening. I assumed Pete had come back for something he'd forgotten. I could hear footsteps and the sound of someone moving around in the garage. "Pete?" I called out. "Is that you?" There was no answer, but the footsteps stopped. I sat up on the cot and looked around the garage. It was dark except for the small space heater, which cast a dim red glow. I couldn't see anyone, but I had the distinct feeling that someone was there. "Hello?" I called out again. This time I heard a voice, but it wasn't Pete's. It was a woman's voice, and she sounded distressed. "Help me," she said. "Please, help me." I got up from the cot and turned on the overhead lights. The garage was empty except for my car and Pete's tools and equipment, but I could still hear the voice. "Where are you?" I called out. "I'm in the trunk," the voice replied. "He put me in the trunk." My blood ran cold. I looked at my car, but the trunk was clearly closed and there was no way anyone could be inside it. I walked around the garage, checking behind equipment and in corners, but I was definitely alone. "Please," the voice said again, "don't let him hurt me." The voice seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I was starting to panic, wondering if I was having some kind of breakdown or hallucination, but the voice sounded so real, so desperate. I decided to check my car's trunk even though I knew it was locked and I had the only key. When I opened it, I found something that made me sick to my stomach. There were women's clothes inside, a dress, shoes, and a purse. None of them belonged to me, and they looked like they'd been there for a while. I grabbed the purse and opened it. Inside was a driver's license belonging to a woman named Jennifer Walsh. According to the license, she was 24 years old and lived about 50 miles away. There was also a cell phone, some cash, and credit cards. I tried to turn on the cell phone, but the battery was dead. I was starting to realize that I might be in serious danger. Pete wasn't just a helpful mechanic. He was someone who had done something terrible to this woman, and now I was trapped in his garage. I tried the garage door, but it was locked from the outside. I looked for another exit, but the only other door led to Pete's office, which was also locked. I was trapped, and Pete would be back in the morning. I spent the rest of the night searching the garage for anything that might help me understand what had happened or find a way to escape. In a toolbox, I found more disturbing evidence, jewelry that clearly belonged to different women, and photographs that I didn't want to look at too closely. When morning came, I heard Pete's truck pull up outside. I quickly put everything back where I'd found it and pretended to be asleep on the cot. Pete came in whistling, acting like nothing had happened. "Morning," he said cheerfully. "Sleep okay?" "Fine," I lied. "Any word on that part for my car?" "Should be here this afternoon," he said. "Why don't you walk down to the diner and get some breakfast? They open at 7. I took his suggestion, grateful for the chance to get out of the garage and find help. At the diner, I asked to use the phone and called the police. I told them about the items I'd found in my car and gave them Pete's address. The police arrived within an hour and arrested Pete at his garage. It turned out he'd been drugging travelers whose cars he repaired, then robbing and killing them. My car hadn't actually broken down. He'd sabotaged it when I wasn't looking, using some kind of device that could disable the engine remotely. The investigation revealed that Pete had killed at least 6 people over the past 3 years, all travelers who'd had the misfortune to break down in his town. He'd dispose of their bodies in the woods and keep their belongings as trophies. I never found out whose voice I'd heard that night, but the police told me that Jennifer Walsh had been one of Pete's victims. Her body was found buried behind his garage, along with the remains of 5 other people. I still don't know if what I heard was real or just my subconscious picking up on the danger I was in. But I'm grateful that something warned me, because if I hadn't found that evidence, I probably would have become Pete's 7th victim. I never trust helpful strangers in remote locations anymore, and I always make sure someone knows exactly where I am when I'm traveling alone. Because sometimes the person offering to help you is the last person you should trust. I was 31 years old and working as a regional manager for a chain of sporting goods stores. My territory covered parts of Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas, which meant I spent a lot of time on interstate highways traveling between cities. I'd been doing the job for about 4 years and had driven those routes hundreds of times without incident. This happened on a Wednesday evening in August. I'd finished a store visit in Dallas and was driving back to my home base in Little Rock, Arkansas. It was about a 5-hour drive, mostly on Interstate 30, a route I knew well. I'd left Dallas around 4 p.m., planning to be home by 9 p.m. The first couple hours went normally. Traffic was moderate, the weather was clear, and I was making good time. I stopped in Marshall, Texas for gas and a quick dinner, then got back on the highway around 6:30 p.m. About an hour east of Marshall, I noticed a white pickup truck that seemed to be matching my speed. It wasn't unusual. People often find a comfortable pace and stick with it on long highway drives. But after about 20 minutes, I realized the truck was staying exactly parallel to me, about a quarter mile behind and 1 lane over. I tested this by speeding up slightly. The truck sped up too. I slowed down a bit, and the truck slowed down. It was definitely following me, but I couldn't figure out why. Maybe the driver was just using me as a pace car, letting me watch for speed traps while they maintained a safe following distance. About 10 minutes later, I noticed a second vehicle, a dark SUV, that had taken up position ahead of me and to my right. Like the pickup truck, it seemed to be matching my speed exactly. Now I had vehicles positioned both ahead and behind me, maintaining precise distances. I was starting to feel uneasy. This seemed too coordinated to be coincidental. I tried changing lanes to see what would happen. The SUV immediately moved to block my path, while the pickup truck moved closer behind me. They were definitely working together. Within the next few minutes, 2 more vehicles joined the formation, another pickup truck on my left and a sedan that positioned itself directly behind me. I was now completely surrounded by 4 vehicles, all maintaining the same speed and staying in perfect formation around my car. I tried to speed up to break free, but the vehicles ahead of me sped up too, staying just close enough to prevent me from passing. When I tried to slow down, the vehicles behind me closed the gap, making it impossible to fall back. I was trapped in the middle of a moving convoy. My heart was racing as I tried to figure out what was happening. This was clearly a coordinated effort involving multiple people and vehicles. But what did they want? Were they planning to rob me, force me off the road? I had no idea, but I knew I was in serious danger. I tried to get a better look at the other drivers, but the windows of all 4 vehicles were tinted, making it impossible to see inside. The vehicles themselves looked ordinary, the kind of trucks and SUVs you'd see anywhere in Texas, nothing that would stand out or be easy to identify later. We continued like this for about 15 minutes, maintaining the same formation at exactly 65 miles per hour. I tried using my cell phone to call 911, but I was having trouble getting a clear signal while driving. The few times I managed to connect, the call would drop before I could explain the situation. Then I saw a sign for an upcoming exit with a truck stop. I decided to try to break free by suddenly swerving toward the exit ramp at the last possible moment. Maybe I could catch them off guard and escape before they could react. As I approached the exit, I stayed in the left lane until the very last second, then cut sharply across 3 lanes of traffic toward the off-ramp. The maneuver was dangerous, but I was desperate. The convoy reacted immediately. The pickup truck behind me tried to follow, but I'd caught them off guard and they couldn't make the turn safely. The SUV ahead of me had to brake hard to avoid hitting other traffic. For a moment, it looked like my plan had worked. But as I reached the truck stop, I realized that one of the vehicles, the sedan, had managed to follow me off the highway. It pulled into the truck stop parking lot right behind me. I drove straight to the front of the main building where there were lots of lights and people around. I parked as close to the entrance as possible and ran inside. The truck stop was busy with travelers and truckers, and I felt safer surrounded by other people. I found a security guard and quickly explained what had happened. He was skeptical at first, but when we looked outside, we could see the sedan parked at the edge of the lot with its engine running. The guard called the police while I stayed inside. When the police arrived, the sedan was gone. But the officers took my report seriously, especially when I described the coordinated nature of the convoy. They told me this sounded like a human trafficking operation, criminals who target lone travelers on highways and force them to isolated locations. The investigation revealed that there had been similar incidents reported on that stretch of Interstate 30 over the past few months. The police believed it was an organized group that used multiple vehicles to surround and control their targets, then force them off the highway to remote locations where they could be robbed or worse. I never found out what would have happened if I hadn't escaped, but the police told me that several people had gone missing on that highway recently. My quick thinking and willingness to take a dangerous exit maneuver probably saved my life. I still drive that route for work, but I'm much more aware of my surroundings now. I watch for vehicles that seem to be coordinating their movements, and I always have a plan for getting to safety if something seems wrong. Because sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones that hunt in packs. I was 25 years old and working 2 jobs to pay off my student loans. During the day, I was a marketing assistant at a small advertising agency, and 3 nights a week I drove for a rideshare company to make extra money. It wasn't glamorous, but the flexible schedule worked with my day job, and the extra income was helping me get ahead financially. This incident happened on a Friday night in October. I'd been driving since about 8 p.m. mostly picking up people going to bars and restaurants downtown. It was a typical night, short rides, decent tips, and no problems. Around 11:30 p.m., I got a pickup request from an address in an upscale neighborhood about 15 minutes from downtown. The pickup location was a large house in a gated community. When I arrived, I saw a well-dressed woman in her 30s waiting by the gate. She got in the back seat and gave me an address across town, about a 20-minute drive. She seemed normal enough, professional attire, polite demeanor, talking quietly on her phone about what sounded like work stuff. About 5 minutes into the ride, she asked me to make a quick stop to pick up her friend. This wasn't unusual. Passengers often added stops during rides, and the app allowed for it. She directed me to a convenience store in a less affluent part of town. When we pulled up to the store, a man came out and got in the front passenger seat. He was probably in his 40s, wearing jeans and a baseball cap, and he seemed to know the woman well. They greeted each other casually, and he thanked me for the ride. "Just continue to the original address," the woman said from the back seat. I updated the ride in the app to include the additional passenger and continued driving. The two of them chatted quietly, and everything seemed normal. But about 10 minutes later, I realized we were heading in the wrong direction. "Excuse me," I said, "but I think we missed the turn for your destination. The GPS is showing we should have turned back there." "Oh, we changed our minds," the woman said. "We want to go somewhere else instead. Just keep driving straight." This made me uncomfortable. Passengers could change destinations, but they were supposed to update it through the app so I could see where we were going and estimate the fare. When I asked for the new address, the woman was vague. "Just keep going this way for now," she said. "We'll tell you where to turn." I was getting nervous. We were now driving through an industrial area with few lights and no other traffic. This wasn't the kind of place people usually wanted to go late at night, especially not people who lived in gated communities. "I really need a specific address," I said. "The app requires it for insurance purposes." The man in the front seat turned to look at me. "Just drive where we tell you to drive," he said, and his tone was no longer friendly. I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw that the woman was no longer on her phone. She was staring at me with a cold expression that made my skin crawl. These weren't just passengers changing their destination. Something was seriously wrong. "Look, I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm going to need to end this ride and take you back to where I picked you up." "No," the man said firmly. "You're going to keep driving." That's when I noticed he had his hand inside his jacket, like he was holding something. The woman leaned forward from the back seat, and I could see in my peripheral vision that she had something in her hand too. I realized I was being kidnapped. These people had used the rideshare app to get a driver alone in a car, and now they were taking me somewhere against my will. I had no idea what they planned to do, but I knew it wasn't good. We were approaching a red light at an intersection. I made a split-second decision. Instead of stopping, I gunned the engine and ran the red light, then immediately swerved into the parking lot of a 24-hour gas station that was brightly lit and had several customers. "What are you doing?" the man shouted. I slammed on the brakes right in front of the store entrance and threw the car into park. Before either of them could react, I jumped out of the car and ran into the gas station, yelling for help. The clerk immediately called the police while I hid behind the counter. Through the window, I could see my car still sitting in the parking lot, but I couldn't tell if the passengers were still inside. When the police arrived a few minutes later, both passengers were gone. They'd apparently fled on foot, leaving behind a purse and a wallet that turned out to contain fake IDs. My car was undamaged, but the police found zip ties and duct tape in the back seat that hadn't been there when I started my shift. The investigation revealed that this was part of a larger scheme targeting rideshare drivers. The criminals would request rides using stolen credit cards and fake profiles, then kidnap the drivers and steal their vehicles. In some cases, the drivers were never seen again. The police told me that the upscale neighborhood pickup had been a setup. The woman had been waiting outside a house she didn't live in, probably after watching to see when the real residents left for the evening. The whole thing had been carefully planned to make me feel safe initially. I quit driving for the rideshare company that same night. The extra money wasn't worth the risk of being targeted by criminals who had figured out how to exploit the system. The company eventually implemented additional safety features, but by then I'd already found other ways to supplement my income. What haunts me is thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't run that red light. The zip ties and duct tape suggested they had planned to restrain me, probably to steal my car and possibly worse. The fact that they'd done this before meant there were other drivers who hadn't been as lucky or quick-thinking as I was. I still use rideshare services as a passenger sometimes, but I'm much more aware of the risks drivers face. They're alone in cars with strangers, often late at night, going to unfamiliar locations. It's a job that requires constant vigilance and the willingness to trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Sometimes the most dangerous passengers are the ones who seem the most normal at first. I was 27 years old and working as a traveling nurse, which meant I spent a lot of time driving between different hospitals and medical facilities across the Midwest. It was demanding work, but I enjoyed the variety and the opportunity to help different communities. The downside was the constant travel, often driving alone for hours at a time. This incident happened on a Sunday night in September. I'd just finished a 3-week assignment at a hospital in Kansas City and was driving to my next position in Des Moines, Iowa. It was about a 4-hour drive, and I'd left around 6 p.m., planning to arrive by 10 p.m. and get settled before starting work Monday morning. The drive started out normally. I-35 North is a route I'd traveled many times, and I knew all the usual stops along the way. By 8:30 p.m., I was making good time and decided to stop at a rest area about halfway to my destination. I needed to use the restroom and stretch my legs after sitting in the car for over 2 hours. The rest stop was one of those basic highway facilities, a small building with restrooms and vending machines surrounded by a parking area and some picnic tables. It was well lit, but not particularly busy. There were maybe 6 or 7 other vehicles in the lot, which was normal for a Sunday evening. I parked near the building and went inside to use the restroom. The facility was clean and well maintained, but there was something about the atmosphere that felt off. It was too quiet, and the few people I saw seemed to be watching me more closely than normal. When I came out of the restroom, I noticed a man standing near the vending machines who hadn't been there when I went in. He was probably in his 30s, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, and he seemed to be pretending to study the snack options. But I caught him looking at me in the reflection of the vending machine glass. I bought a bottle of water and headed back toward my car, but I had the distinct feeling I was being followed. I glanced back and saw the man from the vending machines walking behind me, along with another man who had appeared from somewhere near the picnic tables. I quickened my pace, but they quickened theirs too. By the time I reached my car, they were only about 20 feet behind me. I fumbled with my keys, trying to unlock the door quickly, but I was nervous and dropped them. As I bent down to pick up my keys, I heard one of the men say, "Excuse me, miss." I looked up to see both men approaching me. The one who had spoken was smiling, but it didn't reach his eyes. The other man had positioned himself between me and the rest stop building, cutting off my escape route. "We're having some car trouble," the first man said. "Wonder if you could give us a jump start?" I looked around the parking lot and noticed that several of the other vehicles I'd seen when I arrived were now gone. The lot was much emptier than it had been just a few minutes earlier. More concerning, I could see at least 2 other men standing near different vehicles, all watching our interaction. "I'm sorry, but I don't have jumper cables," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. "That's okay," the man said, stepping closer. "We've got cables, just need someone with a good battery." The second man moved even closer, and I realized I was being surrounded. This wasn't a request for help, it was a setup. I had no idea what they wanted, but I knew I was in danger. "I really need to get going," I said, finally managing to get my key in the lock. "I'm expected somewhere." "This will just take a minute," the first man said, and now his friendly facade was slipping. We'd really appreciate the help. I got my car door open and quickly slid into the driver's seat, but before I could close the door, the second man grabbed it and held it open. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice no longer polite. "We just need a little help." I could see the other men in the parking lot starting to move toward my car. Whatever they had planned, it involved multiple people and had been coordinated in advance. I was outnumbered and trapped. I did the only thing I could think of. I started screaming as loudly as I could while laying on my car horn. The noise was deafening and echoed across the empty rest stop. The man holding my door was startled by the sudden noise and loosened his grip. I yanked the door closed and immediately locked it, then threw the car into reverse and backed away from the men as fast as I could. As I pulled out of the parking space, I could see all four men running toward their vehicles. They were going to chase me. I floored the accelerator and sped out of the rest stop, merging onto the highway at dangerous speed. In my rearview mirror, I could see headlights following me from the rest stop. At least 2 vehicles were pursuing me, and they were gaining ground. I pushed my car to 90 miles per hour, then 95, weaving between the few other cars on the highway. The chase lasted about 10 minutes before I saw the blessed sight of a state trooper parked on the shoulder running radar. I pulled over right behind him, and the vehicles that had been chasing me immediately disappeared. The trooper was initially annoyed about my speeding, but when I explained what had happened, he took it very seriously. He called for backup and escorted me back to the rest stop, but by then it was empty, except for one abandoned pickup truck. The investigation revealed that this rest stop had been the site of multiple attacks over the past few months. Groups of men would target lone travelers, especially women, rob them, and sometimes worse. The abandoned truck contained items belonging to at least 3 different victims. The police believed the men worked in coordinated teams, with some acting as lookouts while others approached victims. They'd choose rest stops that were isolated enough to avoid witnesses, but still had enough traffic to provide potential targets. I never found out what would have happened if I hadn't screamed and escaped, but the police told me that several people had gone missing after stopping at that rest stop. My quick thinking and willingness to make noise probably saved my life. I still travel for work, but I'm much more careful about where I stop, especially at night. I avoid isolated rest stops and always try to stop at busy truck stops or gas stations with good lighting and security cameras, because sometimes the most dangerous places are the ones that seem the safest. I was 33 years old and working as a software consultant, which meant I traveled frequently to client sites across the country. I'd been on a week-long project in Phoenix and was finally driving home to Denver on a Friday evening. It had been a long week, and I was looking forward to spending the weekend with my family. The drive from Phoenix to Denver is about 12 hours, so I'd planned to break it up over 2 days. I drove until about 10 p.m. and stopped for the night in Albuquerque, then got back on the road Saturday morning around 8 a.m. The second day's drive was supposed to be about 6 hours, putting me home by mid-afternoon. Everything went smoothly until I was about an hour from home. I was driving through a familiar stretch of highway in the foothills outside Denver, feeling relaxed because I was almost back to my own neighborhood. This was a route I'd driven hundreds of times. I knew every exit, every landmark, every curve in the road. That's when I noticed the car behind me. It was a dark blue sedan, maybe 10 years old, and it had been following me for the past 20 minutes. At first, I didn't think much of it. People often take the same route when they're heading to the Denver area. But as I got closer to my exit, the car was still there, maintaining the same distance behind me. I decided to test whether it was actually following me. I moved to the right lane, and the sedan moved to the right lane. I moved back to the left lane, and it followed. I sped up slightly, and it sped up. I slowed down, and it slowed down. There was no doubt about it. This car was deliberately following me. My heart started racing. I was less than 30 minutes from my house, driving through an area where I felt completely safe. This was supposed to be the easy part of the trip, the final stretch where I could relax and think about being home with my wife and kids. I tried to get a look at the driver, but the car's windshield was tinted and I couldn't see inside clearly. All I could make out was the silhouette of a single person behind the wheel. I considered calling the police, but I wasn't sure what to tell them. Someone was following me, but they weren't doing anything obviously illegal. They were maintaining a safe distance and driving normally. It would be hard to convince a dispatcher that this was an emergency. Instead, I decided to drive to the police station instead of going home. I definitely didn't want to lead whoever this was to my house where my family was waiting. I took the exit for downtown Denver and headed toward the main police station. The sedan followed me off the highway. Now I was really scared. This person had followed me for over 30 minutes through multiple lane changes and turns and was now following me into the city. This wasn't a coincidence or someone who happened to be going in the same direction. This was deliberate stalking. I drove through downtown Denver, making several unnecessary turns to see if the car would continue following me. It did. Every turn I made, every street I went down, the sedan stayed behind me at the same distance. When I finally pulled into the parking lot of the police station, the sedan drove past without stopping. I got a better look at it as it went by, but the windows were too dark to see the driver clearly. I did manage to get a partial license plate number. I went inside and filed a report with the desk sergeant. He took it seriously, especially when I mentioned that the car had followed me for over an hour and had continued following me even when I drove to the police station. "That's not normal behavior," he said. "Someone who's just going in the same direction would have turned off long before you got here." The officer ran the partial license plate number I'd gotten, but it came back to a car that had been reported stolen 3 days earlier in Colorado Springs. Whoever had been following me was driving a stolen vehicle. The police increased patrols in my neighborhood for the next few days, but the car never appeared again. I never found out who was following me or what they wanted. The stolen car was found abandoned in a parking garage downtown a week later, but there were no fingerprints or other evidence that could identify the driver. What bothers me most is that this happened so close to home, in an area where I felt completely safe. I'd driven thousands of miles over the past week through unfamiliar cities and remote highways without any problems. But the danger found me in my own backyard during the final mile of my journey. I still don't know if the person following me knew where I lived or if they were just randomly targeting someone they thought looked like a good victim. But the fact that they followed me for so long, even when I drove to a police station, suggests they were determined to do something. I'm much more aware of my surroundings now when I'm driving, especially when I'm close to home. I check my mirrors more frequently, and I never drive straight home if I think someone might be following me. Because sometimes the most dangerous part of any journey is the very end, when you think you're safe. The final mile can be the longest mile of all.